Theology Unleashed. I am more than happy to be here once again, and I would like to welcome today's guests, David and Benjamin. Today's topic is going to be discussing on whether the soul exists. So I would like to ask our contendants to present their positions. So Benjamin, you wanted to go first.
Sure.
Okay.
Let me share the screen here. And we'll share this. All right, is everyone able to see my screen?
1 second. Okay, now we should be able to see.
You can see?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So I take the question that we've been invited to answer today is, do souls exist? And so what I want to give is a negative answer to that question in the form of what I'll call the argument from physical minds. And so before I do that, I want to start off with what's known as the mind-body problem. So the mind-body problem in its simplest form consists of what's known as an inconsistent tetrad. And so these are four claims that all seem true, but at least one of them is false. And so any of the three claims that we accept, we can actually deduce the falsity of the fourth. And so those four claims, the first being kind of the dualist's intuition, the idea that our minds are properties of non-physical substances or souls. B is the claim that our bodies are properties of physical substances or matter. C is the claim that minds and bodies interact with each other, and D is the claim that physical and non-physical substances cannot interact with each other. So the physicalist or materialist intuition is that D is true, and so that we can deduce the falsity of A. So that means B and C here are kind of mine and David's common ground. So both of us accept that our bodies are physical substances that are composed of matter. And we both agree that minds and bodies interact with each other. So he and I won't be disagreeing about that here today. So there's two traditions that approach the mind-body problem. One is the dualist tradition and the other is the monist tradition. And I take David to be part of the dualist tradition. And so according to Cartesian or substance dualism, they say no, physical and non-physical substances can causally interact. D is false. Now that causation might be mysterious, but they insist that there can be this kind of causation. Now this is different from the more modern day forms of dualism from the dualist tradition. According to more contemporary forms of dualism known as property dualism, our minds are non-physical properties. So this tradition doesn't deny that there's only one substance. It just insists that this one substance can have both mental and physical properties. And then there's the tradition that I come from, the monist tradition. According to materialism or physicalism, our minds are not the properties of non-physical substances or souls. And this is because physical and non-physical substances cannot interact with each other. Now, when I say that I'm a materialist or a physicalist, what I mean by that is that I'm not an idealist. Within this monist tradition, there's another view that known as idealism that actually denies B and says that no, look, our bodies aren't actually the properties of physical substances or matter. Everything is mind stuff. So when I say I'm a materialist or a physicalist, I mean I'm not an idealist. I'm not implying that mind and matter are identical to one another, nor am I implying that they're reducible to each other. So I'm not a materialist in that strong sense, or even stronger sense, like an eliminativist. So where do I start? How do I approach the mind-body problem? So I have just three guiding intuitions. The first is that minds are real and irreducible features of the universe. The second is that minds and brains causally interact, and that minds are particular features of brains. And so I like to fashion myself as something of a Hegelian these days. And so what I'm really looking for in a view is one that kind of sublates all these intuitions of mine. And that's just the Hegelian jargon for a synthesis. So I want to see if I can combine all of these views into one coherent philosophy of mind. And so these are the anti-reductionist options available to me. Neutral monism insists there's a single irreducible substance, but must be described using both physical and mental concepts. So this is the view that I'll be defending here today. So I won't be defending property dualism. I won't be defending epiphenomenalism, but will I be arguing from neutral monism? An argument from physical minds from neutral monism would look like this. It would say neutral monism implies there are no purely non-physical minds like souls. Neutral monism is true, therefore there are no non-physical minds like souls. But I don't think this is a good argument because F blatantly just kind of begs the question against David's position. David's within a dualist tradition. He's not just going to concede this premise F. So I'll instead argue from what I think are less controversial premises, but will probabilistically support at least three different claims. And these three claims will imply that there are no non-physical minds, such as souls. So the claim that I want to make tonight is I'm claiming there are no non-physical minds like souls because it's probable that all mental changes have sufficient physical causes, that all mental differences imply physical differences, and all mental properties supervene on physical properties. So why do I say that these things are probable? Well, I want to give at least 5 lines of evidence that I say probabilistically support these three claims. The first is that given any known species of vertebrates, directly stimulating a physical brain causes that brain to have corresponding mental experiences. Some physical injuries to brains make it impossible to have mental experiences at all. Which mental capacities are destroyed by injury are correlated to the particular physical region damaged. For example, dementia is an injury to the memory region of brains. The development of mental capacities, including higher order capacities like personality, are correlated with increased neuronal complexity in embodied brains. Minds and their psychological traits are physically related by genetics. So there's 3 ways in which I could say that these 5 claims, E1 through 5, support my 3 earlier claims about supervenience and physical causation and the dependency of minds in general. I could say that these claims prove that there are no non-physical minds, but that would be much, much too strong. I hope it's clear to everyone that that's not the claim that I'm making. Instead, I'm making the more modest claim that these give probabilistic support, such that they're more probable than the negation of those 3 claims. So that's going to allow me to argue from physical minds like this. Necessarily, immaterial substances like souls imply purely non-physical minds, but it is probable there are no purely non-physical minds. Why is it probable there are no physical minds? Evidences 1 through 5. Therefore, conclusion J follows, it is probable there are no immaterial substances like souls. So that's my case against the souls. I take this to be kind of a standard analytic philosophy approach on the intersection of the philosophy of mind and the philosophy of religion. And so I think it's a good dive-in point because it appeals to premises that I think all parties to the discussion can concede are reasonable places to at least start.
Okay, very well. Now I would like David to present his position.
Okay, and I'll also do a screen share. I'm not as together as Ben. I don't have slides, but I have a few hopefully helpful diagrams. And I think, ironically, I think me and Ben have different trajectories. I think he came from a more fundamentalist upbringing and then became more secular, as where I came from a more secular background and became more fundamentalist. Although I guess him within Christianity, me within Judaism. So just show a quick picture. Like I studied in Jerusalem and Hasidic Jewish schools. I've been a practicing Hasidic Jew for over 20 years now. I lead prayers for years of my life. I spent 2-3 hours praying every day. This is a artistic depiction of the Lubavitch Rebbe, who probably was one of the greatest sages of last generation, sent people all over the world to open up synagogues, institutes of God consciousness. It's kind of a depiction of his mind, all these things operating in his mind. A man who had built up thousands of followers, sent them all over the world, and kept correspondence, spoke with thousands of people, was active in all various things. And from a question, the Lubavitch text talk about the city of the soul in the mind, a connection between people and other people within the soul versus some sort of intellectual, like he had just had some sort of wisdom and thoughts and shared them with other people. I want to give majority non-denominational, non-sectarian arguments, largely that anybody could test on their own, of the nature of what is the origin of our consciousness. Does it make more sense to explain it with the soul or with the material realm? And you say, like, dualism, these are mostly Western terms. I appreciate speaking with Ben because he has probably more a formal education in the philosophy to give the correct terminology. So I mean, like, Orthodox Judaism probably wouldn't call herself dualistically, even if that's the school that we fall into. Like Benedict Spinoza was excommunicated, you could say, for possibly being pantheistic, monistic, as opposed to dualistic. But those are Western terms. So just a quick diagram. Here's a Christian example, the famous Protestant artist Lincoln, who you gave a depiction of the soul after death, and a depiction of possibly dispensational times, what happens when a person dies, till the eventual resurrection. Here is Hindu understanding of the chakras, of your various understandings of how the soul operates and how we might feel that. Anyone's done yoga or meditation, say that our essential spiritual element could be higher or lower within our spine. That we hopefully we'll talk more about the distinction of, is this phenomenon, that consciousness, our mind, coming from the body or the soul? And from the Abrahamic understanding, it's supposed to be uncertainty. That some of the Kabbalists write that God created the lowest being possible out of our own accord of recognizing our Creator. That in reality, from a hypothetical God's eye perspective, that man is basically the lowest functioning creature that capable of using our own understanding could recognize our Creator on our own. And also ideas about free will, that it's supposed to be uncertain, that we're not going to unravel this mystery, and that a certain element of free will requires there to be uncertainty, that if God was knowing to us, it would be impossible for us to act or even being, that there has to be somewhat, so to say, the ability for us to reject our Creator and the ability for us to reject our soul. So I'm not claiming that I'm going to be able to provide hard evidence for the soul, but I'm just saying, from the observed phenomenon that we experience, I'm going to argue some of this in pure logic like Ben, but I want to express it in a way that anyone could understand, so to say, using our own mind and consciousness as our own testing experiential battleground. That every person has a mind and consciousness, everybody through our own self perception, self-awareness, self-introspection, could examine, do I feel that this thing that drives me, this consciousness, this controller within me, is arising from my body or from some other realm, so to say, the spiritual realm, from the soul, even if the interaction problem is very difficult to explain, and we will get into that. So here's another diagram from Lincoln, kind of about the mountain peaks of prophecy, kind of like the Hebrew prophecies, missing the church and the vision of what's going to happen at the end of days. So I'm going to get into part of perception, part of how we see the world, and is it more likely to be explained by a soul or from just thoughts like a computer that arises and how we understand the world. So Hare Krishna, I know some Theology Unleashed, Arjun, Ram are part of the Hare Krishna tradition. So here's a nice diagram of so to say, the gunas, the modes of the material realms of Maya, that be passion, goodness, and ignorance. They're kind of like strings pulling us. And so to say, that our mind is not a product of our body, but our mind is a product of these higher forces. And here would be a graphical, artistic depiction of, so to say, the gods or higher forces, using strings to pull at us. Here's the classic model in the Bhagavad Gita of the soul. It's a small picture of the chariot as the soul, where the Greek depiction, you have logos, pathos, ethos, where I guess in John 1:1 you have, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word became the flesh, which uses the word logos. But classically in the Greek tradition, ethos is the soul, the chariot driver, and then you have logos and pathos as the horses. The Vedic depiction is more complicated, where you have the soul as the passenger, the chariot is the body, the chariot driver is intelligence, and the horses are the senses, and so to say, the mind is the reins. And so if you look at the model of what is going on within our consciousness, and so that there's a controller of my body, and so there's a me, there's an I, and that I, like for Hare Krishna, is like, I'm not my body. Me and Ben and Ram are talking right now, and the words are being generated from my physical form, entering the computer and going to whoever is listening. But the I who is talking to you right now is not actually my body. The I is the I that exists in the non-physical realm. And in this depiction here, it would be the soul, and it would be using the faculty of intelligence, and the mind is reining in the senses. And here's another depiction. So hopefully we'll get more into this in the discussion, but to say which model makes more sense with the experience that we're having, that we have some sort of non-physical controller that is what's behind my body and controlling my body and interacting with the material realm, or this phenomenon, the I, is a product of the material. So I want to go with what we call, I guess, in philosophy, if House of Commons was here, the explanatory power. So there's going to be uncertainty. Me and Ben are not going to come to a conclusion, prove one way or another. The greatest minds in all of history have been debating this every generation for as long as human history. And it's largely, the explanatory power, and everybody could use themselves. You don't need to, God forbid, like do experiments on brains and dissect people. Everybody has a mind that we could self-experiment on. Here's another nice picture from the Hare Krishna movement, kind of in the force of spiritual powers either dragging us down or up. And here, classical, maybe Catholics would have a similar understanding of like the 7 deadly sins, but there's these forces that either drag us up or down. And also talk about karma. To understand, we talked last time about karma, hopefully we'll talk about that more. Is the world indifferent to good and bad? Is that just some figment of our imagination, or is there a factual element of karma that also argue has to come from some sort of separate material realm? That material realm can't really come to explain how good and bad, reward and punishment might work. And randomness of these forces is just random that, so to say, a person meets a good devotee or a man of God that directs them in the right direction, or a person meets a devilish force that causes a person to get off track. And here's the classic Kabbalistic model of the four worlds and the spherotes, the 10 emanations. That would be the Judeo-Kabbalistic understanding of consciousness. And I'll close it off with a diagram I made to kind of show the complicated of this matter. I'm a proponent of what I call the multiple truth hypothesis, because I say there is a lot of uncertainty and unknown, and there's a lot of conflicting theories. So maybe me as a Hasidic Jew and a follower of the Vedas might have a similar understanding of the mechanics of how the material and spiritual realm operate, or even Ben, if he's a monist. And the question, if there's only a material realm, everything comes from a material realm. I have it in the diagram like math and logic, higher order rules, and you can argue what's the origin of higher order rules, like science or math, that this holds for all of the material realm. And you could look at that as a spiritual realm or a god. And also just mention atheists, that you don't have to be. As I showed Arjun the latest Pew survey. In fact, 10% of atheists in America believe in reincarnation. So atheist usually means that there's not a deity. So if you see in the diagram, you could believe that there's a separate realm of spirit, mind, soul, and physical matter. And deism just means that there's a deity that is behind both of those. So you could be an atheistic dualist that holds that there's a spiritual material realm, that there's just no deity behind this two, like a Big Bang Theory, how did the world came into existence, that whatever random forces caused the material realm also caused the spiritual realm, or some sort of monism, like Ben might fall into a monistic sphere. And then a question of math and logic. If you say math and logic is a governing principle of the physical and material world, is math and logic also the governing principle of the spiritual world? In the ancient Greek sense of monism and the Platonic forms, it's usually the sphere that is considered the origin of everything. The sphere turns into the four elements that make up the four matters: earth, wind, water, and fire. And in the ancient Greek system, and Vedic, and even Kabbalistic system, or have in their diagram that you have a progression of forces. Some of the Kabbalists might see it like the deity creates the spiritual realm, and from the spiritual realm emanates things like math and logic, and then from math and logic, that's the ruling force over the physical and material realm. So I would say that there's a lot of different ways to understand this, and as I said, I want to make a non-sectarian argument, not necessarily in favor of any given tradition, but for any believer, of just on the phenomenon that we all experience, what is a better explanation of what we're experiencing with our own mind. And maybe if there's time, I had mentioned a few different phenomenon that I believe are better explained with with the soul in a separate spiritual realm. I say that there's the concept of joint attention, which would be could be observationally if two people were standing next to each other thinking about the same thing, or have just invoked a memory of a song or a personality. And there's also studies in even animals that what does it mean when two people have joint attention or focusing on the same thing? Is that better explained by a spiritual phenomenon or material phenomenon? Laughter, actually, the Aristotle claims that laughter is proof of the soul, and that babies don't laugh until they get the soul. And it's an interesting phenomenon, because laughter, unlike a burp or a yawn, is unlikely triggered by something physical. It doesn't necessarily have like sneezing a physical purpose to exhale toxin or something like that. Laughter is usually triggered by something mental. As I said, free will in general, the controller, that there is an I that controls my body and decides what I should say and what I should do. Does it make sense that the mind produces this I, and then the I controls the body? And as opposed to this I that controls me has to exist separate from my body. And as we discussed last time, continuity of self, that I think Ben conceded in the last one, that continuity of the feeling that I am the same person. is hard to explain from a materialist perspective. And the idea of karma itself, that if we say that I do something good, and so to say there's credit stored in a separate realm, then in a purely materialistic system, that if there's an event that was either good or bad, that the material realm can't store whether it was good or bad and how that should be affect a person's karma going forward in the future. If karma is just a figment of my mind, that my mind thinks this event was good or bad, as opposed to saying it's factual, that I did something and it was either good or bad, and that there's some sort of judgment to God or karmatic system that's going to see to it that I get rewarded for the good I do and punished for the bad that I do. And so I also like to argue that that is more readily explained by there being a separate spiritual realm that records whether an action is good or bad. And as Ben will argue, the interaction problem, the spiritual realm that records good or bad action has to have some sort of reactionary with the material realm, that if you do something good, that it's stored in a separate realm and then comes back to do me good later in the future, or vice versa. So appreciate that. I'm not sure how you want to do this, if you want to go point by point, or if you want to reply, or
Okay, so thank you very much for presenting your positions. And now I'll yes. So how would you like to discuss this further?
Yeah, so first off, I want to thank David for such a great opening. It's really great to be able to interact with other traditions outside of one's own. So my tradition that I read the most in is Western analytic philosophy, and one of the um, not so flattering realities of that tradition is that it's not well known for engaging with traditions outside of its own, and largely ignoring things like Eastern traditions or more ancient um, traditions. And I hope that these sorts of discussions help build bridges with other traditions, and so to be able to see kind of just the clash of our two arguments coming together, and being able to put together useful visuals for people to watch, I think is really awesome. And so I want to thank David for putting all of that together for us so that we could see that. And hopefully we can interact in ways that are useful for both of our perspectives. So I know that you put a lot on the table, so I don't know if we'll be able to discuss all of it, because one of those topics was free will, which for me is just a super interesting conversation, but it's also a rabbit hole. We could talk about free will all night. You also mentioned personal identity. So the idea of what makes us the same person through time. What's it the case? What sort of fact is it that's going to make it the case that some future person will be me? Again, super interesting question. I look forward to discussing that. You mentioned karma, but you also mentioned kind of a broader notion of good and bad. We can definitely get into the axiology and moral philosophy of it if you want. But then you also mentioned to some more empirical considerations, like I gave in my opening, considerations like sneezing and laughter. I think it was another really specific example you used. So right there, I see at least four different things on the four different directions that we could take it, assuming that you broadly accept the 5 pieces of evidence I gave in my opening about just general neuroscience and what's known about the relationship between minds and brains of animals, just in general.
Well, some of those might. I would also contend that animals also have souls in some of these questions. Like some animals laugh, animals make decisions, animals exhibit joint attention, and that would also be evidence for animal souls. And so if you want to go over some of these phenomenon and just to look at the explanatory power of a materialist explanation versus a spiritual explanation. In essence, say
So
that the controller,
so let me know what
of
you
the
think of it. I'm sorry, let me know what you think of this then. So how about we start with animals and souls, then we'll work up to the physical observations, things like sneezing and laughter, then things like karma, good and bad, to personal identity, to free will. And then that way we don't get drained out by free will early on. How does that sound?
Yeah, Greg, I'm largely, saying that there's a large amount of uncertainty, and we're not going to, conclusively show one way or the other. And I'm encouraging people to experiment, use our own minds as the experiment and draw our own conclusions. So, so it might be useful to go through, some of these phenomena and just give our understandings of how they work.
So you would contend then that what explains a lot of these observations that we see about, the relationship between minds and brains of non-human animals um, are evidence in a way for these animals having disembodied souls.
Yeah, I would say the explanatory
Yeah,
power of the hypothesis for certain phenomenon that we all observe on a regular basis is, that you would argue is there's more explanatory power uh, towards a physicalist explanation. I would say there's more explanatory power towards a mind-body dualistic explanation.
so one of the questions I would want to ask is, can the soul of us and other non-human animals survive death, or is it only ours can survive death, or neither can survive death? How do you cash that out, or does your view even make a judgment one way or another? I don't want to assume something that you don't claim.
Well, I'm trying to put forward non-sectarian arguments, so I can say, what various traditions say, and I have my multiple truth hypothesis that would recognize there's a whole bunch of various explanations that all have uncertainty. But I say yes, in general, that if there's a mind-body dualism and animals have souls, that force in the animal survives death. That just like I am not my body. That if you have a pet dog, that the identity of the dog is also not their body.
Gotcha. But but that would apply to like all vertebra, right? Like everything with a brain.
It could arguably even refer to like panpsychism and non organic material, but it may be too much to get into panpsychism and whether all material objects have a soul. So if you just want to stick to
Yeah,
mammals or
yeah,
things that
you're
appear to
right.
have
There's
intelligence,
probably
you
yeah,
could
it's
even
probably
argue
going.
as say like an insect that has a life instinct to survive, and is the like if you try to kill a cockroach, that it's going to run, it's going to try to move the opposite direction, and is that force causing it to survive coming from a non-physical element that survives death? So I don't know how high up, so to say, the life form you want to begin the argument, but the essential argument could go for anything that has a clear life force that has some sort of noticeable desire to survive.
So um, you would have to have this immaterial life force in order to do things like sneeze and laugh. Is that right? Like, is sneezing and laughter would be properties of this essentially immaterial life force.
Well, I use laughter because laughter is a product of the mind, as opposed to sneezing that serves a purely physical function of getting rid
Oh, I
of
think I
bad
see your
things
point
within the
now.
body. That laughter is not triggered by laughter is triggered by the mind. So if you want to start with laughter as opposed to the survival instinct that you might go to even simple one cell organisms,
I
and if you
gotcha.
wanted we could argue about that, but it said laughter is differentiated. It exists in animals, but it's likely that laughter is the product of the mind, not the body. I mean, so that you say something funny, like a joke, a play on words, it wasn't anything to do with the body. It was something to do with the mind that triggered the reaction.
And the mind is a property of this immaterial soul. So I'm a materialist of sorts. I'm a neutral monist technically, but I don't deny that we have minds. I just claim that our minds are dependent on physical matter. So minds imply brains is my view. So I don't deny that we have minds, but it seems to me so. Even on my view, if we concede that laughter is a product of the mind, that doesn't get us to something immaterial. Because my view claims that the things can be the product of minds, like intentions. Intentions can be products of mind, but it doesn't imply that they're the properties of immaterial souls. I think that's the leap. Where I don't know what the justification is for the leap to this non-physical soul. Why do we have to have a ghost in the machine for the machine to laugh or the machine to sneeze? There can just be the machine.
That it's triggered by something non-physical. If it's observational, that we observe something that appears out of the ordinary, but more specifically like a pun, a play on words, like a poor joke, like an infinite amount of mathematicians walk into a bar and the first one says, give me a beer, and the second one says, give me half a cup of beer, and the third says, give me a quarter cup of beer, and so on till infinity. And the bartender puts 2 cups of beers on the table and says, know your limits, like the famous Zeno's paradox. And so it's a mental play on words. It's a phenomenon of the mind that you're thinking about something like Zeno's paradox, and it could trigger some sort of laughter, but it had nothing to do with the body. That the mind, something purely mental, would trigger a phenomenon. And actually, I mean, Aristotle is the founder of this argument. That Aristotle himself was the arguer that laughter is a spiritual function. Has said that Aristotle claimed that a child can't laugh until he obtains his soul. And but if you explain, it's more the concept of the controller in the mind, and to say a phenomenon like this is a demonstration more readily explained by the mind being separate from the body, and there's some sort of incongruency, dissonance that causes laughter, as opposed, like, why should a wordplay cause you to laugh? Why should just a pun or some sort of unexpected occurrence cause a bodily reaction?
Right. So the first thing I would want to say in traditional Western fashion is to draw a distinction to make sure that we aren't thinking of two different concepts here. So when you say it's triggered by something non-physical, you say laughter is triggered by something non-physical. You might mean two different things here. You might mean, what I think you want to mean is that it's triggered by something immaterial, by something that's not dependent on material. But but I think the plausibility of your examples come from this other example, which is it triggered by something unconscious? And I think it's true that laughter is triggered by something unconscious, but something unconscious implies consciousness. Conscious and unconscious are mental terms. So I concede to you that laughter is product of minds, but I concede that we have minds, and I also concede that other animals have minds, not nearly as sophisticated as our minds. In fact, one of the observations I appealed to in my 5 evidences is this relation between mental complexity and or physical complexity and the mental capacities that us and other non-human animals have. So I would say that you've also said that other animals exhibit behavior such as laughter. So it seems to me that there is some common evolutionary explanation as to why animals, terrestrial animals, vertebra that we find on planet Earth that live in social societal communities exhibit behavior such as laughter. So I think that that's something that the natural sciences can explain. The question in the philosophy of mind is do that we have to insert something over and above physical causation in order to account for a phenomena like laughter. And it doesn't seem to me to be the case, because even if the strongest form of this argument would be that there's something irreducible about laughter. Well, if we remember, I cast my whole argument by laying out my body problem and three of my presuppositions. One of them was that minds are irreducible features of reality. So I'll go ahead and concede irreducible nature of laughter. But I don't think that avoids the argument from physical minds that are put on the board, because I would still say all of our experiences with laughter imply physical differences. So we don't know of laughter that happens in a disembodied scenario. Every laugh that we have ever experienced has been connected causally to something physical, and something physical has been able to sufficiently cause that.
Well, I mean, we have our competing hypothesis and the explanatory power, and I've done my research. I mean, laughter is an ununderstood. There's over 50 models of explanations for laughter in terms of evidence and research on the brain. There's very little understanding of what actually causes us to laugh, and it's been demonstrated that pure abstract concepts could cause us to laugh, like Arthur Benjamin, the mathematician, 2, 3, 5, 8. Who do we appreciate? Fibonacci, or something like that, where there's an abstract concept, and it could bring this idea of laughter, and so laughter is something that we all experience. That as of now, science has no good explanation for the phenomenon of laughter. I mean, people could do the research. There's tens of theories on the market of what causes laughter, and even if you haven't done the research yet, you're putting this idea of like a subconscious, and then we come back to the hard problem of consciousness, that if the mind is a product of the body, what is this subconscious? Is it likely that the mind produces this subconscious? And I'm not saying we're going to get to the bottom or solve it. I just wanted to produce a simple phenomenon that is extremely difficult for a materialist to explain, and could more readily be explained in terms of a separate controller that does not exist in the body. And as I mentioned, Aristotle, the classic in the Greek school, that laughter was one of the classical examples of a proof of the soul.
So, correct me if I'm wrong. It seems to me that we are aware of a disagreement about the complete explanation as to laughter. Where does laughter come from in our own species, and where does laughter come from in species of other animals? There's competing hypotheses about that. And you're absolutely right. I've not done any research on that. I don't claim to have any sort of credentials to be able to speak on the nature of this disagreement.
An abstract concept could trigger laughter, that something non-physical could be this trigger of laughter. That I could just say an abstract concept, possibly a pun or mathematical type thing that has maybe no even material connection to it, and that could trigger laughter.
Right. So it seems to me that you want to say that there are the explanatory resources that I am making use of aren't sufficient to explain laughter. That's why this disagreement. And so there's an extra ingredient that has to be added to this. This extra ingredient being the immaterial soul. Once we put the immaterial soul in this picture, then we can explain something like laughter. So I'm skeptical that adding the image. So the example I used earlier was a ghost in the machine. So if we have
would say
machines
that
laugh.
has more
Yeah.
explanatory power. Not necessarily could completely explain it by a
But
mind-body
that's fair.
dual,
I'm
but it
sorry.
says
Yeah,
it
yeah,
has
yeah, yeah.
more explanatory power than a material explanation.
Yes. So there's not very good explanatory power given my resources. But if we add your resource, the immaterial mind, we do get more explanatory resources that give more explanatory power. It might not be a complete explanation. I'm with you. I'm not trying to strap you with something so strong of a claim. But you're saying that, look, if we add mind to the picture, we can make sufficient sense of this. That can't be made if we don't add that extra ingredient. And so my skepticism is that adding this ingredient, putting a ghost in the machine, actually does give us that explanatory power. That's where our disagreement is. Why do we disagree over that? So I would again point back to those 5 evidences about. So I think that those probabilistically imply these other claims that mind essentially implies matter. You can't have a mind without something material. That mental differences imply physical differences. I think that you have to have that explanation in play before we even begin to explain a phenomena like laughter that has an irreducibly conscious first-person subjective experience of what it's like to laugh, of what it's like to experience something funny. I would think that those other observations take probabilistic priority, in the sense that those are any explanation that doesn't have those in is going to have to, by adding that, to use the analogy, when we add that ingredient of the immaterial soul, we're also adding in the interaction problem. How does this immaterial, irreducible substance causally interact such that our bodies laugh? So that's
We
a
might have
problem.
argument of framing also, where you're kind of framing it that materialism is the default hypothesis, and I could reverse that and say that dualism, the soul as the origin of the mind, is the default hypothesis, and from the historians that your relatively atheism or materialism is a recent phenomenon, and your own ancestors, even your own, maybe parents, your own family, that you yourself were brought into a dualistic environment, and so you to frame materialism as the default hypothesis, we might contend that also.
Well, so keep in mind that when I framed everything at the start, I had 4 claims for the mind-body problem, and I highlighted 2 of them in green. And I did that for a reason. So that was our common ground. We both conceded B, that bodies are the properties of physical substances. So it's not that I'm framing the problem in some unit. I'm framing it in those ways that we both can agree on, to then say, okay, look, there's these 5 evidences, these 5 facts that are of the same type of fact that B is. These are physical observations. These are observations from our experience. These claims probabilistically support the view that, look, there is this necessary connection between mind and matter. And if we don't have that necessary connection, boom, we get the interaction problem. We get the problem that just seems to plague dualism historically. And I think the model that I'm putting forward helps us see why that is. It says because from our common ground, from our common background knowledge, that bodies are physical substances, that brains behave in certain ways. By just admitting these observations, we already have probabilistic support for those theses that mind implies matter.
Well, I would make a fundamental contention, because I said, like I said, that I am not my body, and I contend that you are not your body, and any of the people watching are not the body, and that there is a soul that, as I gave the diagrams of the chariot and the chariot driver, that this phenomenon of the I or anybody individual watching, the contention is say that that is non-material, even though obviously I reside in the body and I'm communicating, I'm using the body, I have a brain, there's some sort of interaction, but I'm making the fundamental contention that even if Ben thinks that he's his body, that unfortunately he's mistaken in the hypothesis that he's not his body, and that the essential him that is thinking and talking and having this conversation is not a product of his body, but a product of his soul. And so if I want to lay that out, that's the default hypothesis, as where you want to frame it, that I am my body, you are your body, is the default hypothesis.
Right. So I think it'll help to start with what I take to be a characteristic of a good argument. So this is a good argument is separate from a sound argument. So a sound argument is an argument that is valid and has true premises. But a good argument is an argument that starts from, it has the properties of a sound argument, but also has other features. It has these features like appealing to claims that all parties can accept, that are uncontroversial among disagreeing parties. So what do considerations look like that in which all the parties can agree about? Well, one of those observations, I would argue, is behavior. We can agree on the behavior of humans. We call that psychology, and we can observe the behavior of other animals. So, and we were talking about behavior earlier with laughter. But now we're moving down a level. We're moving from this domain of common observation, like behavior, to the nature of personal identity. The idea of I am not my body. So now we're moving to, so we were more confident about those third person observations about behavior than we are about these metaphysical claims about personal identity. There's much more disagreement about the nature of personal identity. I'll give you an example. You and I have different views of personal identity. So you have a non-reductionist view of personal identity, the idea that there is some further fact that makes it the case that you are the same person through time. Whereas I'm a reductionist about personal identity. I believe that it's psychological connectedness that makes us the same person through time. I don't think that there's something else. I can see that I am not identical to my body because I am not identical to each successive chain of psychological connectedness. These are metaphysical commitments. So we can disagree about the nature of personal identity. That's why I don't think an argument that would start from the nature of personal identity would be a good argument. It might be a sound argument, but it's dealing with those. You see how we're going to have these big metaphysical disagreements. That metaphysical disagreement is going to get even deeper the further we go if we say that, look, free will, choice, agency requires this further fact. So again, I'm a compatibilist about free will, whereas you're likely not a compatibilist. You think that there's, if I'm wrong, please correct me, this idea that we cause our actions, that we are an actual cause of a choice in the sense that there's this irreducible feature about us that determines our acts and not antecedent causes like the laws of nature or the will of God, but actually us. We have this further. So again, we can start there. Like we can start our arguments from personal identity or free will, but those
Isn't
are
that
much
the fundamental
more
thing we're
controversial.
arguing here? I meant to interrupt you with saying that that's what we came here to argue, is that I'm arguing, and presumably the majority of the people watching this are more on my side, or maybe a small crowd, is to say that I am not in fact my body. I am my soul, and my soul controls my body, and you are arguing that souls do not in fact exist, and that we are in fact our body. And then we're looking at experience that we could agree on, that even though in my understanding that the I, who is not my body but controls the body, we both laugh and we both experience the same physical world, and we just have a different explanation for what's going on, that in my mind, my understanding that this I does not exist in the physical realm, and my body exists in the physical realm, but whatever controls my body does not exist in the physical realm. And you're, contending that that the I does exist in the physical realm and is a product of the physical realm. And we're looking at phenomenon that we could agree upon and saying what has more explanatory power, as does the I arise from the physical, or is the I something that is not part of the physical and controls my body from some separate material, immaterial spiritual realm, conceding the interaction problem.
Yeah, if I can just jump in for a second, I think the fundamental disagreement comes from Benjamin. When you were presenting your argument, you presented some probability there, and you have stated that the probability that the soul doesn't exist is more than the probability that the soul exists, or the probability that the soul doesn't exist is more than 0.5. So this, I guess, this is what David is trying to talk about, where you make this assumption that the soul most likely doesn't exist. Obviously, this assumption is backed up by 5 points that you've made, but then David could also present his own point and then make the same assumption, but for the opposite views. So I guess if I could just intervene and clear things up.
Yeah, so I think that's largely right. So I do want to emphasize that I realize that you are starting from a set of premises, okay, and you're well within your right, and that might be sound. You might have sound reasoning here. I'm not saying that you don't. What I am saying is that our disagreement is over the nature of a monist tradition and a dualist tradition explaining reality. And so we're going to have to appeal to observations to support our the hypothesis, the traditions. I'm going to appeal to a set of observations, and that's meant to make my position more probable, my tradition more probable. Whereas you're going to appeal to a set of observations, and that's going to make your view more probable. So what I think
explanations or observations, say we're agreeing on
yes,
observations.
explanatory power.
The explanation is it a better explanation that the I is not material and not the body and the controller or of the body that exists in some sort of separate realm, or that the I is a product of the material, and then a series of phenomenon that we could agree on and agree upon the observation of the phenomenon better explained by which hypothesis.
Yes. So what is different about our approach here? What's different about our approach are the observations that we're appealing to, the premises in our argument, the premises that support argument. So this is my distinction between a good probabilistic argument and a not so good probabilistic argument. So a good probabilistic argument is going to appeal to observations that all parties can accept. So I think the 5 lines of evidence I appealed to are such lines of evidence because they're observations of behaviors. They're physical, empirical observations that we've gathered from tests. So that's why I think they're ones that we can all agree are the case. The other claim I'm making is that they probabilistically support 3 claims that I made about the mind-brain relationship that imply there are no non-physical minds. That's what I think is the strength of my argument. Now, your observations appeal to datums like, I am not my body. But that's not exactly what, I concede that claim. But what you mean is, I am an immaterial substance. Well, now you can't just say, without begging the question, you can't just say that the observation that makes your hypothesis more probable than mine is an observation that entails your hypothesis. That just begs the question. That's why I said my 5 claims don't deductively entail. I'm not saying that those 5 evidences prove my position. I'm not saying that. That would beg the question against you. That's why I didn't give an argument from neutral monism. So what is the observation? Is the observation that we make choices, that we stay the same person through time, that us and other animals laugh? What is the observation that we can both agree raises the probability of your hypothesis? Because
Can we
if
try a
it's
different thing, maybe joint attention, and maybe like what type of music do you like?
I like rock music, so I am wearing a Neck Deep shirt. They're a pop punk band.
So we say hypothetically, like from a materialist perspective, the only material realm that exists is the current form of the material realm, and the material realm of the past doesn't exist anymore. But we could think of something like, let's say, a common song that we both like, and then have joint attention to something that doesn't exist in the current realm. That if we're both thinking, I mean, just example, something like a Led Zeppelin or a Metallica song that we could both think in our head and have a common idea of this concept that doesn't currently exist in the material realm, but we both have the same perception of this event, even though it occurred in the past. So if you say from a material perspective, you're saying that, okay, you have a memory in the mind, and we have joint attention, so to say, because we're both in our own minds separately thinking about the same phenomenon that occurred in the past, as opposed to like a dualistic spiritual explanation that would say the I exist outside of time, that even though the body, there's only one material realm at any given point of time, that the I that experienced it exists outside of time. So when we joint experience something that is more readily explained, even if we mention like a person, like a deceased ancestor or someone from the past, like George Washington or the Lubavitch Rebbe or what whoever your hero is, that doesn't materially exist in the material realm anymore, but we could both focus our attention on it. So and it'll be the same argument for something like karma in good and bad. Does it make sense more that we're both using our minds, and our minds are focused on our best perception of this event that doesn't actually exist in the current realm but is a product of thought, or that the I and the you, the joint attention, that the I that is me and the you that is you and thinking about the exact same thing is not existing on the material realm, is not a product of something in the material?
So there's a lot there. So let me just take it in 2 pieces. So I'll say something about memory, and then I'll say something about good and bad. So sorry, that's just writing that down to remind myself. So we would say, I would say that yes, memories are mental capacities. They are what we would say are mental. They're part of our minds. But again, my neutral monist view is that implies something physical. So the second line of evidence that I gave was that some physical injuries to brains make it impossible to have mental experiences, some even at all, in which mental capacities are destroyed by injury or correlated to the particular physical region damaged. So it could be the case that my brain gets damaged, and the song that we remember experienced in the past is just not even something accessible to me, because my memories necessarily imply something physical, and something, that physical thing was destroyed, it was damaged, it was injured somehow, such that I can't have that corresponding mental experience. So again, like, my neutral monist view is going to interpret the certain observations in certain ways, which is why I appealed to these third person evidences, these evidences that are directly related to the relationship between minds and brains, but they don't require me to appeal to anything that's a first person subjective experience of my own or of any other particular individual. These are all third person facts. that we can all agree on as a matter of empirical experience.
Well, would you agree that the past, from the materialist point of view, that the past doesn't exist? There's only the present, the material state that it's currently in, and the past may have caused it to be in the state that it's in, but the past no longer exists. So if we were at a concert together and the song played and we have a memory of the same event, that doesn't exist anymore. The only thing that exists is the memories in our head, and might have caused some sort of action that caused the material realm to be in the state that it is, and that from a material perspective, you have to stick to that the past doesn't exist. It's just a precursor to the present.
I think this is an excellent question. I think this is an excellent philosophical question. In traditional philosophical fashion, I'll say it depends. It depends on what our view of time is. So the view of time that your example presupposes is this idea that the past doesn't exist anymore, the present is currently real, and the future is not yet real. So it's this idea, this idea of temporal becoming. But there's another, that's called the A theory of time, the tensed view of time, tensed, past, present, future, divided up, these hard division lines.
The
There's
past
another
exists in
view.
the mind. I mean, we'll separate the material, but certainly the past exists in the mind.
Yeah, so there's another view of time. It's called the tenseless view of time, or the B theory of time. We get these terms from McTaggart, I think. And this is the idea where the past and present are equally real. There's just a moment in space-time, and you can say earlier or later than that, whatever particular moment in space-time is. But all points on the timeline are equally real. So if you think of a timeline like a loaf of bread, instead of that timeline being like a moving spotlight, it's like a loaf of bread, and there's time slices. And so you get a picture of each slice through time. These are so if you were to ask me which view of time do I lean more towards, I lean more towards that eternalist model, the B theory of time, where past, present, and the future are all equally real. So if you were to ask me that your question, do you think the past still exists, whether it's in our mind or not, I am going to lean toward it. It depends. It depends on our view of time, and my view of time is this tenseless view of time. But I realize that's a controversial view of time. So I wouldn't want my datum to be dependent on such an assumption that required, to make some determination between an A and B theory of time in order, because just all parties aren't going to accept that observation.
We have a meeting, so I use the example of music, an event in the past. So we could have a meeting of the mind that we both remember this song and have a meeting of the mind that this is something we have joint attention on, even though it doesn't exist in the presence. And, so for the explanatory power, is that meeting of the mind existing in the spiritual realm or in the material realm? So, I mean, as a materialist, our brain is producing some sort of memory, and your brain produces that memory, my brain produces that memory, and there might be a mismatch, but that we're both like computers that are bringing up from our own hard drives some sort of memory of the past, and then from that we create a joint experience, as opposed from a dualistic understanding that event or the mind, the experience that our mind experienced of that event in the past exists separate from our body and isn't like a computer producing some sort of memory, and then be the explanatory power. What any individual watching this, or me and you, what makes more sense to the experienced phenomenon of this joint attention?
Right. So this is where I would then go back to the mind-body problem and characterize my neutral monist view. So I believe that there's one reality. There's just one substance throughout all of the world. However, we describe this substance in two different ways that are not reducible to one another. One is mental, the other is physical. physical world is described in what's called the logical space of causes. The realm of law is what it's the jargon, to use the Hegelian terminology, whereas the other language game is characterized as the logical space of reasons. And that's where things like mental experiences, intentions, reasons are all cashed out. And so you have to have these two, they're two sides of the same coin. There's only one coin. And, the phenomenology of the coin, if I'm looking at one side of the coin, I can't see the other side of the coin. So I'd have to turn it around. I can only look at one side of the coin at a time. That's just the phenomenology of mind and matter. I can only talk about mind in one way, and I can only talk about matter in one way. And I can't reduce the two to one to another, just like I can't reduce the coin to one side. In order to understand the one coin, I have to have characterize both sides of the coin. In order to describe the one world, I have to describe both the logical space of reasons and the realm of law, the mental and the physical language games that it describe the one reality. However, one implication of this view is that there are no non-physical minds. It's that mind implies something material. Mind and matter are two sides of the same coin. You can't have one without the other. That's the argument that I'm trying to make. This also helps. I meant earlier to say something about good and bad. I'm sorry, you've mentioned karma. So one thing that my view implies is that there is no such thing as karma, that there is no force that is going to align self-interest with something like impartial benevolence, the requirements of morality. They're just on a collision course. However, that doesn't mean that there aren't these things like good and bad, and things can't go better or worse. So anyone who follows my work in the philosophy of religion knows that I also work in the area where religion intersects meta-ethics. The idea of what does it mean for something to be right or wrong? What is it to be a right or wrong action, given certain religious and non-religious assumptions? I think that they can be robustly objective truths about what matters, but that doesn't require anything beyond the neutral monism that I put on the table. Now, granted, there's other anti-reductionist options, but that neutral monist tradition that my background comes from is compatible with the argument from physical minds. That I'm putting, someone could be an eliminativist, they could be an epiphenomenalist, they could be a property dualist, and they would still be able to use the reasoning that is core to my argument from physical mind.
Yeah, so maybe we should also cover, good and bad. But I mean, if you understand at least my contention about shared memories or joint attention, that if the material mind has to produce this memory, and we're producing separate memories of something that occurred in the past, that we don't have a joint experience, that maybe me and you were at the same concert, but now in the present moment, all that exists is our memories in our mind. And I'm saying from a dualist perspective, you could say like, no, that event exists somewhere else in an immaterial realm. So it isn't our material mind trying to conjure up a memory, but there's this spiritual imprint that still exists, and that's actually what we're conjuring up. And so we move that into the question of good and bad, like unsolved mystery. God forbid, like Jack the Ripper, or like what happened to Hitler, how he died, or your modern court case and trial, like Ahmaud Arbery, or one of these cases where maybe there's video, but presume that there's a murder mystery, and there's only a little bit of evidence, and so assume there was an event, something happened, maybe the person's guilty, maybe they're not, and we say, well, historically an event occurred, and at the present moment there's not enough information to decipher what happened. God forbid, maybe the person's guilty of murder, maybe they're not, and there's just not enough evidence, and so the court said they're innocent. They could go through the rest of their life like they're innocent without charge, because there's not enough material evidence. And from the materialistic view, that's it. Like there might be a court of law, there might be a factual event that occurred in history. But that's it. From as humans, we could have ideas in our mind about justice and what we think is good and bad, and could come to a meeting of the mind of how we should run society. But there's not, like, so to say, an objective, this is what happened, this was good or bad. And then in a separate realm, like, from a Judeo, like, Christmas is coming, like, Santa Claus, he's making a list, he's checking it twice, whether we were naughty or nice, that list, according to the theology, can't exist in the material realm. In the material realm, we may not even be able to understand what happened in history. There's countless, mysteries and, murder mysteries, good or bad mysteries, disputes over whether people were good or bad people. Some people are saints to one culture and villains to another. But from a dualistic perspective, you say that there, just like I talked about, just a simple memory, that there's this factual recording of what happened still exists, and it could still exist. From a materialist perspective, it can't still exist. All that could exist is the imprint that it caused to the current state of reality. But from a dualistic perspective, you're like, no, everything that happened in the past still exists in this separate realm, and hence you could have the concept of karma, good and evil, which I think you've been willing to admit that from the materialist view, you have to say, like, that it's largely a preference, that the factual material realm doesn't have a bent towards justice and is indifferent to our suffering. And to me, that's one of the strongest arguments that they say, like, no, there is a factual recording of what happened in history, and for that to be the case, it has to exist in a separate non-physical realm.
So I want to try to make it clear what I am conceding to you. So lest I be thought of as being uncharitable. So I concede that one of the areas in which the dualist tradition has an advantage is that it seems to adhere more with people's everyday experience. So what do I mean by that? So we kind of one of the insights into Buddhism is that one of the reasons that we're so unhappy is because we read the self into the world. There isn't the traditional Buddhist view denies that there is this self, and it's that these false beliefs of reading ourself into the world that is the cause of a lot of misery and suffering in our lives. And it's that when we let go of the ego, that we can transcend and conquer something like suffering. So it's natural for us to read this irreducible ghost in the machine. So to unlearn that is certainly difficult. It's difficult, because it just seems like, yeah, there is this further fact about personal identity. It seems like there is something other than the antecedent causes of reality and the laws of nature that are determining my actions. It seems like I am the author of my agency, and that it makes sense to say that I am responsible for some act because I did it through my intention, not something else in the world, something I did. These are very deeply ingrained assumptions in our phenomenology. And what I am saying is that those are mistaken. So I am arguing that something, and a libertarian view of free will is false, and that a compatibilist view is closer to the truth. I am claiming that a non-reductionist view of the self is wrong, and that a reductionist view of the self is closer to the truth. And I am arguing that, compatibilist free will is sufficient for something like moral responsibility. So I realize that these are implications in philosophy that a lot of people are uncomfortable letting go. And so if you are sympathetic to views that are very much to the other camp, much to the dualist camp, more to the dualist camp than me, then yeah, you're going to find David's arguments more persuasive. You're going to be more sympathetic to them, which is why I emphasize so much the importance of a good inductive argument. Inductive argument that appeals to evidences that all disagreeing parties can concede. The evidence that I appealed to, an epiphenomenalist can concede, a neutral monist can concede, a substance dualist can concede, a property dualist can concede. All parties throughout the discussion can concede these facts. That's why I think it's such a powerful argument. If we're going to appeal to observations that require our hypotheses, our views, to interpret those observations, I don't know how we're going to resolve our disagreement, because at that point we're just letting our presuppositions clash without actually looking for a common ground that discriminates between our views.
Yeah, I don't think we're going to resolve our disagreement. Obviously, the greatest minds of almost every generation have had these exact same arguments, so it's unlikely we're going to resolve it over internet debate. But hopefully, it's informative.
But we can resolve our
people who watch
disagreements.
it to understand.
We won't have the last word. We won't have the last word for sure. You're absolutely right, and that's a super huge point of humility.
Yeah, I'm going to walk away still thinking I have a soul, and that's me. You're going to walk away, thinking that you're a result of the material body. That it's unlikely.
A little too optimistic.
Well, I mean, you'll say, okay, we changed our minds at one point in our history. That okay, I was born secular and I had an atheistic period in high school, and you were born religious. So obviously, people could change their minds and worldviews, and probably average people might go through periods of their life that change their mind many times, even if a person retains in a religion that they give up their religious belief. And so I'm talking a worldview, and we're talking logic and explanatory power, and there's large amounts of uncertainty. So I did the research in just something like laughter, that you could assume, or the hard problem of consciousness in general, that you could assume, if you're a materialist, that eventually the scientist, psychologist will come up with a reasonable explanation to why people laugh. Even if you look into it and you see that maybe I'm right, and as a fact, the current state of neuropsychology, laughter is largely a mystery, and it doesn't mean that if you look into it, oh man, I didn't realize that laughter is actually a scientific mystery. Doesn't mean that you're going to all of a sudden become religious and start chanting Hare Krishna or something like that. But it could be phenomenon, just saying that how well do we understand our current world, and how well the various explanations explain various phenomena.
Would you be willing to concede that whatever the explanation, the correct, so we'll assume there is a correct explanation for laughter, whatever that correct explanation is, it will include the 5 observations that I listed at the beginning. I can read them off again if you're curious, but the point I would want to make is, whatever that correct explanation is, it will include those 5 facts.
The problem is the question of the I and who observes. So say I am not my body, and so if you're looking at the I as material observation, and I'm saying, but the I is not my body, and the I is capable of observing things in the spiritual realm. And so it's the explanatory phenomenon of the understanding of the I not being the body. And if you understand the I of not being the body, then you have the added advantage is that the I could observe more than the I sees. The I could observe possibly the spiritual realm also.
So what would you say right now to the hypothetical Buddhist who denied that there was a self? You said that that the idea of a self is an illusion. What would you say to that person?
Well, there's many ways to say. If you want to say like a monotheist, and saying that the I, even as like a Hasidic Jew, I might say that the I is the self, because the soul is not really me; it's part of God, and that this I that controls the body isn't an individual. So you get that's why I have the multiple truth hypothesis, that once you come on to saying that you believe that there's a material and spiritual realm, that there's countless explanations for the interaction problem in who is the I. So you could be a Buddhist when they say that I doesn't exist. They're not saying that the material realm is the only thing that exists. They're saying that the I that controls the material body that derives from the spiritual realm isn't uniquely you, but is part of this greater unity of all spiritual forces. Is like there's an I, and there's a Ben, and there's a Ram, and whoever's watching this. But in reality, there's only one entity that's the source of all of those I's, and there's an illusion that they're separate. So I mean I think we're more arguing materialism versus dualism, and whether we have souls, then you could have alternative visions of how dualism works, or is there unique souls, and is my soul, so I mean, you're rejecting that there is a unique soul of me and unique soul of you, versus someone agreed that we have souls, and then understanding what's the origins of our souls. Is the my soul unique in a separate entity, or are our souls part of some collective, and it's just an illusion that the I is unique, but it's not a disagreement of whether the I comes from a non-material realm.
So I think it's important for me to say something simply as a point of clarity. So in my argument from physical minds, my premise H was an analytic truth. So it was true by definition. So it was, that claim was necessarily immaterial substances like souls implied purely non-physical minds. And so I am making an assumption there that what we mean when we talk of souls are disembodied minds that do not depend on anything physical or otherwise material and might survive death. So this leaves open a question of whether there's a collective soul or whether or not our souls evolve through time. It leaves that's a really good question for you, David. I know you mentioned earlier that non-human animals might also have a soul. Do our souls evolve? Like, are those features that something like biological evolution would select for souls?
Well, maybe we could save that for a different discussion, guys. I think our fundamental disagreement is whether souls exist at all, rather than that if you accept that there's souls, like like if I could
That's
argue
fair.
for my
That's fair.
tradition, or is to say the empirical problem that I believe the I that is me doesn't just observe the material realm, but observes the spiritual realm also. So if you're saying that's an illusion, there is no I that's immaterial and observes the spiritual realm. And then
For sure.
if you came
And
from
for
a
those,
theistic
for
view,
the
we could argue that. But I mean, you seem to be rejecting any version of the soul or collective, or that it may pay to save that for a different argument.
this is a perfectly acceptable move for those people listening. So the question we're discussing today is a constitutive question. What is, the nature of reality? Something like the soul. Whereas the question I just asked was more of a historical question. What is, how did this thing come about? And so you don't have to answer the historical question in order to have an answer to the constitutive question. It's
Now I put you to rank it. I mean, you're assuming that.
yeah.
I mean, not that you're saying that there's a 0% chance that we have a soul, but you think that the evidence is overwhelmingly in support of being materialistic.
So
but if you said that
I'm not
there
going to
was
say
going to be a
overwhelming.
soul, would you think it's more probable that each individual has a unique spiritual soul, or that there's a collective soul, and the same essence that makes me is actually the same essence that makes you in all animals? And then, from like a Vedic perspective or a Kabbalistic perspective, if there is a unique non-material, I and all these other entities, how does that work in the spiritual realm? So that, that's the difference in our postulates in your 5 axioms, where I'm saying, well, this I not only observes the material realm, but also observes the spiritual realm.
Yeah. So I forgot what I was going to say. Dang it. Okay, now I remember. So what I was going to say is that I'm not going to make the very strong claim that it's overwhelmingly probable that my view is true. I wanted to make the more modest claim and say, no, it's just probable. It's just greater than its negation that these other three claims are true, that mind implies matter. So really, but my claim in a nutshell is it's probable. It's more likely than not that minds imply matter.
Yeah, I mean, I like all of the programming, and like Theology Unleashed has had a lot of guests that went into detail and like the ontological argument and the very philosophical arguments. And I want to take more of the perspective that each individual has their own testing ground of our own mind. That we all have minds, and we all have this question: what's the origin of our minds? And we could look at like a logical argument. You could read a book. You could go over the greatest minds of history, or the various texts that have declarative statements on it. But we all have our own mind to experiment with, and then could examine the explanatory power. People do meditation, and say, oh, there's an I, there's a mind, and then there's the I that observes my own mind. And from me being the observer of my own mind, that I would use some sort of scientific method to say, well, what is the origin of my mind? Does it make more sense that it's coming from the brain, or does it make more sense that it's coming from some non-materialistic source?
Did we want to move to audience questions now? We're at the hour and 30-minute mark.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah,
I mean,
so
do you
that's
agree
what
with
I was
that?
just about to
The
say.
premise I made about people could use our own minds. I mean, you could be a PhD, you could be a scientist and have more conclusive expertise, but in reality, everybody has their own mind and could largely test it on themselves by introspection of our own mind and examining whether we think that this I that is me comes from the body or comes from some other source.
So yeah, thank you very much, guys. I think you have presented your views, and then you have come to a certain, not
Reasonable
conclusion per
disagreement.
se. Yeah, reasonable disagreement, let's
Yeah.
say. Yeah. So we're approaching the 2-hour mark, and I would like to introduce the questions from the viewers, and there are plenty, so hopefully we can cover all of them.
Okay.
And the first question is, I believe, for David Nir Moldahor. He wants to know, where do you get the "I am not the body" from? So where do you get this idea?
Well, I mean, I've heard it from traditions, from spiritual teachers, and so I'm arguing that you could go to your guru, and your guru or your rabbi or priest, and he could tell you you're not the body, but each person has our mind and a body and could make the conclusion for themselves. So I went to university. My father's a medical doctor. I almost considered going to medical school, and I also studied in religious schools and go to my local Hare Krishna temple and do interfaith. But I'm proposing that everybody could conduct the experiment on our own mind.
I think it's an appropriate place to start, given where David's premises started, which was the nature of personal identity. And so the broad views about the question of personal identity are that I am my body, I am my brain, I am my memories, or I am my soul. So to say I am not my body is to just say, look, that you just don't accept that solution to this problem of personal identity, that you instead think that you're, like Locke, and it's memories that's essential to personal identity. Or you might, be someone who's a substance dualist, like Swinburne, and thinks it's a soul. Or there's certain neuroscientists who would say that no, it's your brain. It's what makes person the same person through time is their brain. So if you accept any of those three questions, answers to the question of personal identity, it just follows I am not my body.
Well, I mean, Ben, did you accept that self-introspection could be a valid source of the answer to a person's own, because we all have the same question, so to say, and that, I could give an answer, you could give an answer,
Well,
but that
sure,
introspection is a valid.
Well, yeah. So I think what you call introspection, I call rational intuition. And so I think it's obviously how we have things of knowledge of things like mathematics and logic and practical reasoning and morality. So I certainly don't discount it as an epistemological tool, but it's also something of a trivial fact that just everything is just what it appears to us. We're kind of stuck in our own first person perspectives, and so that it's just trivially true that things just are the way they seem to us, regardless of how people try to gaslight us. You know what I mean? Like at some point, I think this is one of Descartes' insights. There's just certain things that you can't get behind. Like there is thinking going on. Like I think, therefore I am. There is a thinking being. You're just not going to be able to get behind that.
Okay. Can you hear me well? Because the comments say that I have some connection issue.
It's got a little bit of a robot-y voice, but I mean, I can understand you.
Okay, that's fine. So another question is from the Church of Entropy, and it says that here, is physical specific enough to be useful? So is that term that we use, physical, is it specific?
I think so. So I think there's certainly legitimate questions that we can ask about the language game, which ways in which we use the term physical, which ways are appropriate and which other ways are more or less appropriate than others. We can certainly quibble about it. However, I do think that it's useful enough. I think there's certainly a intuitive distinction between something like supernatural and natural, which can easily be co-opted into physical and non-physical. And we can also talk about being extended or not extended in space-time. So something is physical if it's extended in space-time, whereas something is non-physical if it's not extended in space-time. So there's certainly ways in which we can cash out the term physical and its negation non-physical in ways that are certainly useful.
And David?
Yeah, I mean, me and Ben are both engineers and scientists, and from the question of mind is not really a question of science because you only have psychometric data. You can't actually measure mind. We could measure neural signals, we could measure the output of bodies, but to actually measure minds, you have to ask a person and have some sort of introspection and take that as valid. And from a scientific perspective, like a psychology, a soft science, or a hard scientist, and some people who are materialist in the heart bomb of consciousness are actually moving towards the rejection of mind in totality. So I think that we didn't cover that area completely about physicalism and what's the difference between psychometric data and self-proclaimed data about the mind.
This is also a super interesting question that just gets, inevitably philosophy leads us to, the knots that we have to untangle. And so our very idea of objectivity, this idea that something is true if we doesn't depend on any subjective characteristic. Consciousness, subjective experience, surely there are truths about what it's like to be in pain or what it's like to have certain experiences. Certainly there are truths about it, but what is it for those to be true? How is it that we can have this objective knowledge of something that is so radically subjective and in which our methods seem to kind of filter off? But part of the very methods of objective knowledge themselves seem to be removing these subjective characteristics away. And so there's this huge question in the philosophy of science. What is it even to have, and in philosophy of mind, I should say, as well, like, what is it to even have knowledge of these things that we all clearly have knowledge of it. And some, can be the distinction between propositional knowledge and knowledge by acquaintance. So we can have a propositional knowledge is knowledge of a proposition, whether it's true or false, but knowledge by acquaintance is something that we know directly. And we think that, we can't put what it's like to taste a strawberry into a proposition. So it's this other kind of knowledge that we have direct acquaintance with, and how to catch all that. And these are huge thorns. And, this is where epistemology meets philosophy of mind, meets philosophy of science, and it's just a knot.
Mhm. Yes. So another interesting question is coming from Api, I believe. And it says that for the debaters, what is your opinion on orchestrated objective reduction and it allowing for the soul? So quite a technical question. So
Yeah,
let's see if
I
you guys have anything
have
to
no
say.
idea what was it? Orchestrated
that's the
Orchestrated.
objective
Penrose-Hameroff
reductionism?
hypothesis.
I don't know what
That's
that
I,
is.
I believe it says that consciousness comes from subatomic, or the soul comes from subatomic particles, basically. If
Yeah,
I'm
hopefully
right,
we'll get
David,
more
maybe
into
if you're
it.
more
It's
knowledgeable.
the Stuart Hameroff and Roger Penrose hypothesis, and it's actually, Penrose is more materialist, and Penrose, I think, is actually Buddhist, maybe spiritual leanings. But the concept that quantum phenomenon, Penrose had wrote The Empire's Mind, and that you based on information theory that reduction of quantum phenomenon could possibly result in consciousness. And then Penrose, anesthesiologist, suggested that microtubules could be the place in the mind that harnesses these quantum phenomenon. Me and my streaming partner, Church of Entropy, have gone in depth, and hopefully we'll be able to get someone like Stuart Hameroff himself, or an expertise on the subject. You could interpret it as a material explanation, like quantum mind is in essence just a more in-depth explanation of what's going on in the material realm, or you could interpret it as some sort of answer to the interaction problem, and that quantum phenomenon are something, that like the brain is a receiver, and that quantum phenomenon could be as a solution to the interaction problem. So that's definitely one of my favorite topics, and one of the most groundbreaking areas in the hard problem of consciousness now. So hopefully, someone like Stuart Hameroff, Hirananda Goswami, the Professor Resnick, did a conference, and he was on this channel, and he did a joint conference with Stuart Hameroff. So that'd be a big land if you could get someone like him himself to come on this channel and explain that.
Maybe we can arrange something, hopefully. So another question is actually by your streaming partner, Church Entropy, and it's how can we test for the material correlation of consciousness?
I mean, it's so. Let's say either phenomenon. So like Ben is saying that most materialists, that you have lesion studies, or various studies where like electrodes, MRIs, EEGs, and that you could do these various experiments with the mind. And but also, if you're a dualist and you look at the brain as a receiver, that in India it's more popular. In America, almost all neuroscience researchers are materialist. In India, there's a lot of mind-body dualists that also research the brain. But if you had the hypothesis that the brain is a receiver, and you're not looking for the evidence of the brain producing the mind, but you're looking for evidence of the brain receiving the mind from a separate spiritual realm. So I would be more interested in that type of research, but certainly here in the West, that's not considered within the domain of science. And I said in India, there is some research where people hypothesize that the brain is not the producer of the mind, but the receiver of the mind. And then you would have some sort of theory, not like Descartes and the pineal gland, but maybe something like orchestrated reduction or quantum phenomenon, where you're claiming that consciousness comes from some separate non-material realm, and then a method that you would use to use the same neural correlates of consciousness, EEG signals, MRIs, that would try to demonstrate that consciousness is being received by the brain or projected by the brain as opposed to produced by the brain.
So I found two lines of research to be super interesting. So the argument for physical minds is something that I've been working on for a couple years now. And one of the studies that I've followed is about dementia research. So when we do certain scans of people's brains with dementia at certain stages, we can actually predict the level of cognitive decline and of what kind of cognitive decline they will have at each stage of as the brain degenerates. But there's also good news on the other side of this, in that restoring certain brain functions can restore, not completely restore certain mental capacities, but can help them function better. And so I've always found that to be just really super interesting. I've also been affected by my own family with someone with dementia, so it's a subject that kind of hits close to home as far as an interest in wanting to pursue and understand it more, and which led me to another area of research that I've found fascinating, and that's in the area of genetics. So one of the things that we can do is map the human genome and its genetic sequence. And within that, we can find the information which probabilistically predicts what sort of minds and psychological traits we will inherit from people like our parents. So like if you had a parent that was depressed and you ended up suffering from depression, there's very likely a genetic link between those two. So these are two, both in this area of dementia and in this area of genetics. I think we found incredible ways to understand the physical relationship between minds and brains in ways that have implications for the argument for physical minds that I gave.
Well, Ben, if I asked you hypothetically that could you design these experiments like lesion studies as opposed to trying to demonstrate that the brain produces the mind, but as a way to solve the interaction problem, and if the theory is the brain receives the mind from some separate realm, and could you imagine some sort of scientific experiments that could be tested as the brain is some sort of receiver from an extra dimension?
I don't know. I'll be honest with you and say that I don't know, and I'll also make it clear to the audience that these studies that I am referencing, I wish I had them in front of me so I could actually quote them, are not studies done for the purposes that I am using them here. So, this is the research that I've done on dementia. It comes from a wide range of different papers, but they're almost all their experimentation, the ways in which they design their experiments are solely for progressing medicine as far as dementia, patients go, and our understanding of how to treat dementia, not so much, is this how minds and brains are created? However, this is information that is used by philosophers of mind because the findings are so interesting, even though they were designed for rather different purposes. Can you and I construct such an experiment that could improve upon these other experiments that have done? I don't know. Maybe that'd be awesome.
We don't have to rehash debates that happen on this channel, but I mean, you've had other guests on this channel. I think like Professor the neurosurgeon Egden. That the example of the lesion studies, they're usually designed to show that this area of the brain produces this phenomenon, could also be understood as the receiver, that this area of the brain is the part that receives that part of phenomenon. So a person who's damaged that part of the brain can't produce that phenomenon, not because that part of the brain produced that phenomenon, but because that part of the brain received that phenomenon. So it's an interesting area of research and debate. And I said, like,
It's
in
neat
the
because it's what it does is that it's one of those examples where our observations don't discriminate between the hypotheses. The hypotheses predict they're evidentially equivalent. The observations that they predict are what we will observe. So we can't appeal to observations in order to discriminate between them, like we
as I
would
mentioned,
something like. Go ahead.
I mean, in the West, it's almost universal that it's a materialistic direction of science. It's the consciousness studies in the West is part of anesthesiology and like medicine, and usually related to improving someone's health, or specifically to the field of anesthesiology and surgery. In India, there are universities that have a more spiritual bent and analyze the same phenomenon from like a dualist perspective.
Okay. So we can go on to a couple more questions. I think there are just two left. Another question by Church of Entropy. So how can we, one second, yeah, how can we determine acceptance criteria for a consciousness model? So
That's like the $40 million question in neuroscience right now.
yeah,
I'll be straight up and answer. I don't know yet. That's just one of the big outstanding questions in the philosophy of mind, and I don't know. It's another knot that I have to untangle, and I don't know how well I am at untangling it. Go ahead, David.
Yeah, it requires people like me and you working together, and like Hamerov or Chalmers and these various consciousness conferences that presumably we would have to have different models and see how the models explain the observed phenomenon. And the hard problem of consciousness, because none of the models are sufficient to explain the phenomenon. So the hope that there will eventually be a model that would sufficiently explain the phenomenon, and then till then you're going to have competing models that basically only fit part of the evidence. And like I said, the greatest minds of basically all of recorded history have debated these same issues, and to largely little consensus.
yeah, I guess this is kind of a hard question. We can have multiple models for consciousness, but then even in physics, we cannot have a model that completely describes reality. So with consciousness, it's such a difficult topic. I don't think we can have
Yeah.
a precise topic that describes every individual part of it. So
If
it's
we could
kind of,
name the necessary and sufficient conditions of consciousness, there would just be no disagreement. And
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you got to recruit more great minds to appreciate that that really we've only tapped the beginnings of understanding this topic, and that it's worthy of more research. And even that it's not like me and Ben have a serious disagreement there, like the essential nature of whether the eye comes from the material or spiritual realm. But like science, that we would be able to sort of say work together to understand the phenomenon better, and like a scientific method that even though we have such a fundamental disagreement of the explanation of reality, that somehow we would come to an agreement on the observed phenomenon and its implications.
Yeah. So guys, I think this is a great note to end the discussion. I would like to thank both participants. Thank you very much, Ben. Thank you very much, David. And hopefully we can see you guys once again on Theology Unleashed. It has been a pleasure to be the host for this wonderful discussion. Okay.
thank you so much for
Thank
having me, David. Thanks again. This is so much fun. I live for these kinds of discussions, and David's always just such a joy.
Yeah, I appreciate it. And said this should be the start of things, because said it's a really big question that probably like me and Ben from different schools have been already dedicating the majority of our adult life to, and bring together more and more people that largely dedicating their lives to these topics, is you're probably what's going to help make progress.
Okay, thank you very much once again, and thank you very much all the wonderful viewers. Okay, see you, bye.